Somewhere out in this quiet corner of Minnesota, a boulder the size of a cottage sits alone in a flat field, and no one can quite explain how it got there. Around it stretch drowned marshes, ridges of ancient oak, and the crumbling stone walls of farms that failed and were left to the woods. This is Louisville Swamp, a wild pocket of river country just an hour from a major American city, yet somehow forgotten by it. The trail ahead runs through Glacier, Prairie, and Ghost, all folded into a single afternoon walk. Come with us, and we will show you how this ground was made. Louisville Swamp lies on the east bank of the Minnesota River, near the small towns of Jordan and Carver, in Scott County, Minnesota. It is one unit of the Minnesota Valley National Wildlife Refuge, a ribbon of protected land that follows the river for about 70 miles. That refuge is unusual because it threads directly past the edge of the Minneapolis and St. Paul metropolitan area, one of the few large urban refuges in the country. Yet the moment you step onto the trail here, the city vanishes. What remains is floodplain, savanna, and marsh, held in a stillness that feels much older than any road. The refuge itself was established in 1976, protecting a corridor that development had very nearly swallowed. Today it spreads across roughly 14,000 acres, divided into 11 separate units scattered through 7 counties. Louisville Swamp is one of the larger and wildest of these, some 2,600 acres of marsh, forest, and old field. The trails here are natural surface, unpaved and unhurried, meandering between high ground and low. You do not so much visit this place as wander into it. To understand the swamp, you first have to understand the valley that holds it. The Minnesota River today is a modest, brown, lazy stream, far too small for the enormous trench it flows through. That valley is nearly a mile wide in places, with steep bluffs rising on either side. A river this size could never have carved something so vast. The land is telling us that a far greater force once passed through here, and to find it we have to go back to the age of ice. As the path drops toward the water, the character of the ground changes underfoot. The dry oak ridges give way to darker, richer soil, the kind laid down by centuries of flooding. In wet years, much of this lower ground disappears entirely beneath standing water. Refuge staff estimate that Louisville Swamp floods 3 years out of every 5, and the trails through the bottoms can close for weeks. To walk here in a dry spell, as we are, is a small piece of luck. Around 12,000 years ago, the great ice sheets of the last glaciation were melting across the north. Their meltwater pooled into an immense lake, called Glacial Lake Agassiz, larger than all the present Great Lakes combined. When that lake finally overflowed its southern rim, it unleashed a torrent geologists call Glacial River Warren. That single ancient river, not the quiet stream we see today, gouged out the mile-wide valley of the Minnesota. Everything in this refuge sits inside the scar it left behind. When you walk the flats of Louisville Swamp, you are walking across the floor of that vanished mega river. The ground is astonishingly level, the way only a scoured riverbed can be. Ridges that rise from it are the bones of older, harder land the flood could not sweep away. It is a strange thing to feel small beside water that has been gone for 10,000 years, and yet the river left more than a valley behind. It left a witness, and it is enormous. Out in one of the flat fields stands a single gray boulder, rounded and worn, roughly 15 feet high and 100 feet around. Geologists call such a thing a glacial erratic, a rock carried far from its birthplace by moving ice and then dropped when the ice melted away. This one is unrelated to any bedrock nearby, a stranger set down in the middle of a plain. It looks like a piece of cosmic slapstick, an absurd giant marble left where it plainly does not belong. People have clearly been climbing on it for a very long time, and its smooth top invites you to do the same. Standing at the base of the boulder, it is hard not to think about the sheer weight of time pressed into it. Ice hundreds of feet thick once ground across this land, plucking the stone from somewhere far to the north and dragging it here over centuries. When the climate warmed, the ice released it, and it has not moved since. Generations of farm children, hikers, and wanderers have scrambled up its flanks. It may be the most patient monument in Minnesota. On the higher, drier ground above the flood line, the forest opens into something rare and beautiful, an oak savanna. This is neither dense woodland nor open prairie, but a blend of the two, scattered oaks standing over a floor of prairie grasses and wildflowers. Before European settlement, savanna like this covered great stretches of the American Midwest. Today it is one of the most endangered habitats on the continent, and only fragments remain. Louisville Swamp holds one of those precious fragments. Walking through the savanna, the light is completely different from the closed forest below. Sun reaches all the way to the ground, and the grass moves in long, slow waves with the wind. Savanna survives only where fire is frequent, because fire clears the brush that would otherwise grow into thick forest. For thousands of years, that fire came from lightning and from the deliberate burning of native peoples. Here, refuge crews now set careful prescribed burns to keep the old rhythm alive. The signature tree of this savanna is the Bur Oak, and it is built for exactly this life. Its bark is thick and corky, armor that lets a mature tree shrug off the grass fires that sweep through. Its branches spread wide and low, because with no crowding neighbors it never had to race upward for light. Some of these oaks are well over a century-old, quiet survivors of drought, flood, and flame. Each one is a small ecosystem, feeding woodpeckers, squirrels, deer, and countless insects. Leaving the bright savanna, the trail bends back down toward the heart of the swamp. Cattails and reeds close in, and the air grows heavier and cooler. Water control structures on nearby Sand Creek help manage how deep the marsh sits from season to season. In a place that floods so often, that management is a delicate balance between too dry and too drowned. This is the beating wetland heart that gives Louisville Swamp its name. A swamp can look, to an untrained eye, like wasted ground, but it is one of the most productive habitats on Earth. The still water and thick vegetation shelter fish, frogs, turtles, and an enormous web of insect life. That abundance feeds everything above it, from herons to muskrats to the great flocks that pass overhead in spring and fall. For much of the 20th century, wetlands like this were drained without a second thought. The refuge exists in large part to undo that mistake. Following the edge of the open water, you begin to notice how much is moving. A splash in the reeds, a ripple with no wind behind it, a sudden burst of wings. This is a crossroads on one of the continent's great flyways, and the traffic can be extraordinary. Timing matters enormously here, for the swamp in migration season is a different world than the swamp in high summer. Patience and a quiet step are rewarded. The Minnesota River Valley is a highway for migrating birds, and Louisville Swamp is one of its rest stops. In spring and autumn, ducks, geese, and other waterfowl pour through by the thousands, dropping into the marsh to feed and shelter. Protecting habitat for these travelers was one of the founding purposes of the entire refuge. Alongside the waterfowl come warblers, herons, and birds of prey. More than a dozen species here carry some conservation concern. To the patient watcher, the swamp is never truly silent. The trail climbs again now, rising toward higher ground that overlooks the swamp. From these ridges, the whole shape of the land reveals itself. The flat green bottoms, the dark line of the river, the bluffs beyond. On a clear day, hawks ride the thermals that lift off the warming slopes. It is the kind of vista that rewards you for the climb, and it is the kind of place people have been drawn to for a very, very long time. From the northern high ground of the Mazomani Trail, a broad vista opens above the swamp. Hawks wheel on the rising air, and small songbirds like yellow warblers flit through the brush along the edges. Views like this were not lost on the people who lived here long before any refuge existed. Elevated ground meant safety, sightlines, and a place to read the movements of game and weather. To stand here is to share a lookout with countless generations. Long before it was called Louisville Swamp, this river valley was Dakota homeland. The Minnesota River, which the Dakota knew by their own names, was a central artery of travel, trade, and life. The trail we are walking carries a name that reaches directly back into that history. It is called the Mazomani Trail, and the name is not decoration. It honors a real man and a difficult chapter that this ground remembers. Mazomani was a chief of the Wapit in Dakota, one of the bands whose territory embraced this stretch of the Minnesota River. His name is often translated as Iron Walker, or one who walks on iron. He led during one of the most turbulent periods in the region's history, as treaties and settlement pressed hard upon the Dakota nation. Naming the trail for him keeps that memory present, on the very land his people knew intimately. It is a quiet act of remembrance underfoot. The Dakota presence here was not fleeting or thin, it was rooted and deep. Along this part of the river, on a terrace above the water, once stood a substantial village. Places like it were centers of family life, farming and gathering, occupied season after season. The river gave fish and travel, the savanna gave game, the bottoms gave wild rice and plants. To understand this land only as a nature preserve is to miss half its story. The nearby Dakota village was known as Inyansiaka Atanwi, often rendered as the village at the Little Rapids. It was a place where Wapit and Dakota families lived, farmed the river terraces, and gathered in season. Archaeologists have studied the site closely, and it stands among the most important early historic Dakota places in Minnesota. Its fields and lodges tell of a settled, agricultural life along this water. The refuge lands carry that older map beneath the newer one. Into this Dakota world came the fur trade, and with it, the first threads of European contact. The rivers that had long served native travel now carried traders, goods, and new pressures. Alliances, marriages, and rivalries wove the newcomers into the fabric of the valley. It was the beginning of an immense transformation, one that would eventually remake who lived on this land and how. But at first, the trade simply followed the paths the Dakota had always used. Early in the 1800s, the fur trader Jean-Baptiste Faribault operated a post in this vicinity. Around the year 1802, men like Faribault lived at the seam between two worlds, dependent on Dakota knowledge, kinship, and goodwill to survive and profit. The post was a node in a trade network that stretched across the continent and across the ocean beyond it. For a time, native and newcomer economies were tightly, uneasily entwined here. That balance would not hold for long. By the middle of the 19th century, the treaties had opened this land to a flood of homesteaders. Immigrant farmers, many of them German, arrived to break the prairie and clear the bottoms. They saw in the savanna and floodplain a chance at a farm of their own. What they did not fully reckon with was the river itself, and its stubborn habit of reclaiming the low ground. The ruins ahead are what that reckoning left behind. Off the trail stand the decayed remains of a stone farmhouse, once home to Sebastian Ehmiller and his family. The old records list the children by name: John, Joseph, Katharina, Christina, Gabriel, and Alvis, a whole household raised on this ground. They built in stone, hoping to last, and farmed the fields between the boulder and the swamp. But the flooding that defines this place made a farming life here brutally hard. Today the walls are barely visible, sinking slowly back into the savanna. It is easy, walking these recovering fields, to feel the ambition and the heartbreak in them. Someone cleared this land by hand, stone by stone, and believed a family could prosper on it. For a while, perhaps it did, but 3 floods in every 5 years is a cruel arithmetic for a farm. The land the settlers fought is now, gently, taking itself back, and the refuge lets it. The best preserved of the old homesteads is Jabb's Farm, and its story is remarkably specific. The barn was raised in 1880 by Robert and Anna Riedel, solid and built to endure. In 1905, Frederick Jabbs bought the farmstead, some 379 acres, and moved his family in. They lived here as subsistence farmers, wringing a living from difficult ground until 1952. For most of a century, this was somebody's whole world. Reaching the Jabbs site on foot feels like arriving at a small lost settlement. Because the ground floods so readily, the farm is easiest to reach in a dry season like this one. The setting is peaceful now, framed by oak and grass, the labor and worry long since faded. It is a place that asks you to slow down and simply look. And what you find are walls of stone that have outlasted the people who raised them. At Jabb's Farm, you can still walk among the ruins of 3 limestone buildings, and they remain in surprisingly solid condition. The stone was quarried and set by hand, and it has stood against more than a century of hard Minnesota weather. Moss softens the corners now, and young trees lean in close, but the shapes of rooms and doorways are unmistakable. Standing inside them, you can almost hear a farmyard that has been quiet for 70 years. They are the truest monuments this trail has to offer. As the loop carries us back toward where we began, the land feels less like a ruin and more like a recovery. The prescribed burns, the wetland management, the patient protection all add up to something hopeful. Rare birds like the red-headed woodpecker have a stronghold here again, drumming in the old oaks. A place once drained, farmed, and nearly lost is slowly, deliberately being made whole. That, in the end, is what a refuge is for. In a single afternoon, this trail has taken us across 10,000 years, from a melting ice sheet to a stranded boulder, from a Dakota village to a German farmstead, from drained wasteland to protected wild. Louisville Swamp holds all of it at once, layered quietly beneath the oaks. It asks little of a visitor except attention, and it rewards that attention richly. If you ever find yourself near the Minnesota River, come and walk it slowly and let the ground tell you its story. Thank you for watching. Follow for more of the trails of the world.